Ok, so good afternoon, everyone. Boa tarde para os que nos assistem do Brasil. Today, I have the pleasure to receive in the University of São Paulo Law School, thanks to Zoom, for a special class about the impeachment in the USA, Professor Joshua Braver from the University of Wisconsin Law School at Madison. Professor Braver has a double background in law and political science with a BA in the University of California, Berkeley, with his PhD in the Yale Department of Political Science and a JD at the Yale Law School. He is one of the editors of the US Constitution and Comparative Constitutional Law, Texts, Case, and Materials. He also participated in the Oxford Handbook of Constitutional Law in Latin America, edited by Professor Conrado Ubner Mendes, Roberto Gargarella, and Sebastián Guidi, with an article about the Bolivian Constitution. Finally, from this small sample, he authored a forthcoming book by Oxford University Press called We, the Mediated People, Popular Constitution Making in Contemporary South America, in which he compares the constitutions of Venezuela and Ecuador, where populist leaders supported semi-authoritarian constitutions, to Colombia and Bolivia's that avoided the same path by democratic adaptations. For today's debate on impeachment as a part of the South-North Dialogue series, I am pleased to have my colleague, Professor Rafael Mafei, the author of Como Remover Presidente, published in 2021. The book presents how to hold the Brazilian president accountable during the coronavirus pandemic and a social, economic, and political crisis. For this dialogue, we shall consider that the legal mechanism of impeachment was inserted into Brazilian constitutional tradition by the influence of the US Constitution. Moreover, both countries face difficulties holding their presidents accountable for their crimes and misdemeanors, the attacks against democracy that caused thousands of deaths. Professors Braver and Mafei, thank you for accepting my invitation. Professor Joshua, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. I'm so excited to be here. Thank you, Maria Paula, for the invitation, and thank you as well, Rafael Mafei. I'm here, I hope, to teach a few things to you all, but also I hope will be an opportunity for me to learn some things about the differences between our respective countries on impeachment. I'm very curious to understand Brazil, and I'm just at the very beginning of understanding some things about your system. So here we go. Everybody can see the slides? Great.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So impeachment. Okay, so this is kind of the outline of the lecture I'll give. We'll first talk about Charles Black's article, who lays out the basic framework of when you can be impeached. Then we'll try and apply that framework to various historical examples in United States history. Starting my timer here. We'll look at President Trump's impeachments, and if there's time, which I doubt there will be, we'll look at the role of the Supreme Court. And along the way, I'll make a couple notes, very short notes about maybe Brazil to foster discussion. So the basics of impeachment, right? There's the grounds for impeachment. You know, when can you impeach the president? What does the president have to do wrong? What kind of wrongs does the president have to commit for you to impeach him or her? And there's the process of impeachment. So the process of impeachment, I'll explain right now. There's two steps. In the first, the House impeaches the president. This is like bringing a charge. This is saying, this is what the president, we accuse you of doing wrong. And the threshold is a majority vote. This is the lower house, the House of Representatives. But just because you're charged with some kind of wrongdoing doesn't mean that you're actually guilty of it, right? And so then we have the Senate, and the Senate tries the impeachment, right? It tries to figure out whether the president is actually guilty of this charge. And the threshold for conviction is 2/3 of the members present, right? So they hold hearings, they call witnesses, and you have to have, we have 100 senators right now, so you have to have 67 senators to convict a president. Okay, Let's talk about more detail about the grounds for impeachment. So this is the relevant constitutional provision, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 4. The president, vice president, other officers shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of, and there are 3 grounds: treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. And it's other high crimes and misdemeanors that's been the charge for impeaching and trying to convict presidents throughout history. It's also the one that's caused the most confusion. You know, it's not treason and bribery is reasonably well defined in our law. High crimes and misdemeanors is not. And so we'll spend a lot of time today trying to think through what are high crimes and misdemeanors. So in the United States, one of the ways that we think through what a constitutional provision means is we go back to when that provision was drafted, right? We want to understand if the people are the ultimate authority for the Constitution and the people voted for this Constitution, what did they think impeachment meant in 1787? And so I included in the Charles Black reading, right, this little exchange when they were drafting the Constitution. And at first, when they're drafting this part of the Constitution, the first draft says, we'll only impeach the president for treason and bribery. Mason, Colonel Mason, who's pictured on the right, he objects and he says, treason as defined in the Constitution will not reach many great and dangerous offenses. So Mason is saying, this is not enough, right? There are going to be other times that we're going to want to kick out the president, fire the president, besides for treason, besides for bribery. We need more criteria, more ability to fire the president. And so Mason moves and he says, let's add the word maladministration, right? Administering the government badly. Madison, another member of the delegate, he objects and he says maladministration is, quote, equivalent to a tenure during the pleasure of the Senate. All that means is he's saying that means that you would be able to fire the president anytime you didn't like the president's policies. Mason says, okay, and he throws in high crimes and misdemeanors, and they agree. So just to simplify this a little bit, there's 3 steps: solely treason and bribery. The convention rejects the idea of maladministration, and the convention adds high crimes and misdemeanors. So whatever high crimes and misdemeanors is, it's something that is more narrow, more specific than maladministration, right? The main takeaway is maladministration or general dislike of the president's policies. And we'll come back to this when we talk about Andrew Johnson. We also could talk about it in terms of Bolsonaro and COVID, right? That is distinctly rejected in the US system as a ground for impeachment. Okay. So I was curious when I read maladministration and was reading about the Brazilian Constitution, it reminded me of this phrase in your own Constitution, probity and administration, right? So in our Constitution, maladministration, you cannot impeach someone for that. But in the Brazilian Constitution, you have this phrase, right? Acts of the President of the Republic are impeachable offenses, especially those against the, I'm losing some words here, but the phrase is probity and administration, right? Here's it in Portuguese. I'm not going to try and pronounce the Portuguese version. And so I guess the question for me is, probidade, probity administration, what's the difference, do you all think, between what was rejected in the US case, maladministration, and what's accepted in the Brazilian case, probity and administration? Are they the same thing? Is probity and administration as wide, as broad as general dislike in office? Or does it mean something more specific? That's something I would be curious to learn from you all. My impression is it's more specific, but I'm happy to be corrected. Anyway, moving on to Charles Black. So Charles Black gives us a framework for what's impeachable. Right? And his first point is that high crimes and misdemeanors, they don't have to be crimes. Just because something is a crime doesn't mean it's impeachable. And he says, why? Well, it's under-inclusive. What under-inclusive just means is that there are some things that are impeachable, but they're not crimes. Right? He gives the example, if the president went for a permanent beach vacation, he gives the example of the Virgin Islands. But what if we could say he went to Copacabana, right? He hangs out in Rio and refuses to do any work anymore. That's not a crime, the president not showing up to work, but it's not a crime to get a perfect tan, but we would still think that's impeachable. Or an even better example, if you refuse to appoint any Roman Catholics to office, if you decide to pardon in the US system, the president can pardon people, all police officers who kill someone under any circumstances. Those would all be impeachable offenses, but they're not crimes. He also talks about things that are under-inclusive. There are some things that are crimes that are not impeachable offenses. So if the president jaywalks, right? If the sign says you cannot walk across the street right now, it's time for cars to go, and the president goes anyway. Common crime. People do it all the time in the United States. I think they probably do it a lot in Sao Paulo as well. We wouldn't say that's an impeachable offense. Okay, so it's not a crime. What is it? He uses a rule of construction. This is a Latin phrase. Because them generous. My Latin is as bad as my Portuguese, right? But it means of the same kind, right? If you say, bring me some ice cream, some candy, something else good, and then for that something else good, you bring me a baked potato, I'd say, what's wrong with you, right? But if you bring me cake, I'd say, yay, I love cake. I'm going to put some ice cream on this cake, right? Because the list of all those things were sweet things. And so when I say, bring me something else, I want something sweet. I want some cake. I want some licorice, not a baked potato. And so Black uses this idea and he says, okay, what are the essential qualities of treason and bribery? And that's how I'm going to figure out what high crimes and misdemeanors is. And Black's standard is extremely serious, corrupts or subverts the political and governmental process, and is plainly wrong in and of themselves. It's the second standard that we really have to pay attention to. That really does most of the work, right? Corrupts or subverts the political and governmental process. I'll call this often abuse of power. The president uses the powers of his office. He uses presidential powers for personal gain, right? This kind of abuse of power. And so Black kind of takes this for a test run. He sees, how does this criteria work, right? You can see Black's test on the upper right. He says, well, let's look at our previous examples. If the president takes a permanent Copacabana vacation, if he appoints only Roman Catholics to offices, if he pardons all cops, those would all meet the criteria according to Black. Another example, if he uses the federal tax system to consistently harass his opponents, right? He says, constantly looks through the taxes and personal finances, not because the person's cheated on their taxes, but because he wants to make his life difficult, that would be impeachable. Oh, murder while in office. The president goes, finds someone he doesn't like, and he shoots them in the heart with a gun. Right? Would that be impeachable? That's a little bit more difficult for Charles Black, right? Obviously, it's plainly wrong. Obviously, it's an extremely serious act. But does it meet the second criteria, the one that I said was key? Does it corrupt? Is it an abuse of power? And Black struggles with this and he says, look, it's a tough case. But if the president just murdered someone in cold blood, just murdered someone for no reason, that would so discredit him or her or them that it would be impossible for them to continue in office. That at least is Black's idea. So tough case. He gives the example of impoundment of appropriated funds for the purpose of destroying authorized programs. There's no reason you, or frankly, students in the United States today should know this, but this was a controversial issue when Charles Black was writing about how the president can use funds given to him by Congress. How much discretion does he have? And the point is that this was a possible violation of the Constitution, but there was reasonable disagreement about it. Some people said that this was a violation, other people didn't. You know, it could go to the Supreme Court where people would have a eventual ruling on this. And Black says, you know, there are these disagreements about what's a violation of the Constitution all the time. And if every constitutional violation was impeachable, then we would have impeachments all the time, right? So when we have a reasonable disagreement about what the Constitution means, that can't be an impeachable offense. Okay. So that's Charles Black. We're now going to try, obstruction of justice. My apologies, there's one more. Obstruction of justice, all that means is, you know, there's a criminal investigation going on. The classic expression in the United States is, you know, presidents don't get caught for the crime, they get caught for the cover-up. An obstruction of justice is about the cover-up, right? You lie to the police, you tell other people to lie to the police, you get rid of evidence, right? There's some kind of official investigation and you obstruct it in some way. You don't cooperate with the authorities, but you also lie to them as well or hide evidence. And Black says about obstruction of justice, well, it depends. You know, if you obstruct justice in the way a normal citizen obstructs justice, you know, someone is under investigation for, I don't know, marijuana, and it's just a pitiful thing, and they give you the marijuana to hide, no big deal. But if the subject matter has to do with your official acts as president, and if you are using the power of the office to obstruct justice, right? If you're using your powers as president to order people to lie, then it would be obstruction of justice. Then it would, that obstruction of justice would be an impeachable offense. Okay, that's a lot, and there's a lot more coming. So now we're going to go through some historical examples, right? We're going to see how has this worked in practice. So Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is probably the most famous case of impeachment, though he was not actually convicted. He resigned because it was so obvious he was going to be convicted. I'll say a little bit more about the politics of it maybe, but the basic idea is Richard Nixon was running for election in 1972. And there's a hotel called Watergate, and the Democratic Party, its organization is there. Its plans, its strategy, its secret strategy for how to defeat Nixon. And some burglars come into the Watergate. They steal a bunch of papers from the committee. It's not clear to this day whether Nixon ordered this actual stealing of papers from his political opponent, but it is clear that he tries to cover it up. Right, he pays people money and other acts we'll talk about to try and hide the fact that this ever happened, to reveal the truth of what happened. And the question is, which of these acts are impeachable? So the first charge is about tax evasion. These are the three, simplifying a great deal. This was in the Cass-Sunstein readings. The first charge is tax evasion, right? I think your tax system is a lot more straightforward than our tax system in the way it's administered. So I don't know how these examples translate, but in any case, basically the idea was before Richard Nixon became president, he didn't list all the different sources of his income. He tried to avoid paying taxes. And the idea is this is not an impeachable offense, right? Because this happened before he was in office, right? You have to abuse the powers of your office. And how can you abuse the powers of your office when this was an act you committed before you were in office? So Cass-Sunstein, using something like Charles Black's test, says tax evasion is not the powers of your office. It's not impeachable. What about the second charge, obstruction of justice for the Watergate break-in? So this charge is about the fact that Nixon is paying off witnesses to not cooperate, to lie. Nixon himself is lying to law enforcement, and he's counseling others to lie to law enforcement. And we just talked about obstruction of justice under Charles Black's test, right? This seems like a clear example of what Charles Black and what Cass Sunstein in the reading says is in fact an impeachable offense, right? Why? Because you're not obstructing justice over some pitiful private affair or something like that. What you're doing it is over the investigation over a serious crime, right? A burglary. It's over official business about an election, and you're using the power of your office to do so. I think because as president, you're, I think, using your kind of prestige, I would say, and intimidation, and I think kind of implicit threats. You know, when the president tells you to lie, it's very scary because this is the person who's the most powerful person in the United States, and I think it's implicit that he might use that power against you. So, impeachable. Even more impeachable, even more obviously impeachable, is not Nixon himself or informal advisors telling people to do this, but using presidential power, right? Using the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, right? These are law enforcement agencies. These are spying agencies, right? These are agencies that have the power to put you in jail, to investigate you. When he used this power to harass his opponents who wanted to investigate what happened in Watergate, this is clearly an example of an impeachable offense because it corrupts or subverts the political process. As I said before, Nixon leaves because he knows that in fact he would be convicted for impeachment. And this is a kind of a storied moment. It's a moment in the United States where we think the system really works, where principles and integrity go above it. And why is that? It's because Nixon leaves because Republicans turn against him. Famous Republicans, very partisan, very ideological Republicans, they famously meet with Nixon and they say, Nixon, I want you to know I am more of a Republican than you are. But if you don't resign, I'm going to vote against you. And so Nixon resigns, right? His own party, at least significant members of the party, turn against him. Okay. I should say, you know, at that time, well, we'll talk about it more when we get to Donald Trump. So then we get to Bill Clinton, right? Basically, it's complicated, but Bill Clinton has an affair with his intern, Monica Lewinsky. And it gets entwined and wrapped up in a separate investigation. And so Bill Clinton has to, he's investigated by what we have an independent counsel. And he lies. He lies about his relationship with Monica Lewinsky. He says nothing sexual ever happened between them. And Cass Sunstein says, no, right? This is not an impeachable offense, right? This might seem like something, but like obstruction of justice. We'll talk about it again. But remember, Charles Black told us it has to be about official government acts. And a private sexual affair with Monica Lewinsky is really not about that. And him lying directly doesn't seem to corrupt or subvert the political process. There was a separate case, which is obstruction of justice, mostly in relationship to Paula Jones. Right? He encourages a witness to give false and misleading testimony. He conceals evidence. He pays off a witness. And Cass Sunstein says, again, you know, this is worse than him just lying. But again, this is not about official government business. And it's not like using the CIA or the IRS or the FBI. He's not using the powers of his office to, in fact, stop the justice system from working. So two things. Yes, right, you are lying to police officers, you are obstructing an investigation, but it's not over the official use of governmental power. It's not over something that's political, and you're not using government power when you're doing it. You know, that supposedly, according to Sunstein, is the difference between Nixon and Clinton. Okay. Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson is a really tough case. This is really testing the idea of impeachment. It's really complicated. So if you don't understand all of it, I just want you to get a flavor. But basically, the Civil War happens in the United States. And the idea of the Republican Party and Abraham Lincoln as president, is we're abolishing slavery. Right? The Civil War in the United States is a fight about slavery in the South, and it's Black people who are enslaved, and we're going to try and give Black people rights. Right? We're going to try and give them, if not exactly equal rights to white people, something closer, much, much closer to it. Abraham Lincoln is assassinated, and his vice president, Andrew Johnson, does not like the idea of giving Black people equal rights. He is a racist. Right? And he tries to stand in the way of this process. And Congress doesn't like Andrew Johnson. They want to give rights to people in the South. And they passed this law called the Military Reconstruction. And what the Military Reconstruction Act tries to do is it tries to protect the Secretary of War, Edward Stanton. It's the Secretary of War that's carrying out these policies that the Congress likes to give Black people rights. Andrew Johnson, everybody knows, is going to fire Edward Stanton. And everybody knows that that's his right. In the US constitutional system, the president gets to fire cabinet members. He doesn't need to consult the Congress. And so what does Congress do? It passes a law called the Tenure of Office Act. And it says, you, the president, cannot fire cabinet officers. And if you do fire Edward Stanton, that's an impeachable offense. Now, again, the predominant understanding is that the president does get to fire those officers. This legislation is very likely unconstitutional. So the first charge was he violated the Tenure of Office Act, because actually Andrew Johnson does go ahead. He does fire Edward Stanton. And ultimately Andrew Johnson is acquitted. Right? They hold a trial, and by one vote, Andrew Johnson is not convicted. This is, for many, the worst, most racist policies on the worst president ever. And for most of American history, this was seen as being a success of the impeachment system. Right? It was seen as being a success because the only real reason to impeach Johnson was because of you didn't like his policies, right? What we called at the beginning maladministration. And that is not a reason to impeach the president. At least that's the predominant idea in the US system. And the real test then is, if this is the worst president whose policies you hate the most, but hating policies is not a reason to impeach someone, then yes, this is how impeachment should have worked. That at least is the dominant idea. People challenge this idea. There's controversy around this idea, but that's the basic idea. So I'm curious about Bolsonaro. I haven't followed Brazilian politics as closely as I'd like, but at one point there was a lot of talk about impeaching Bolsonaro because of his horrible policies, and among them being COVID, right? That he botched in a horrible way and is responsible for the deaths of many people. I think that's changed. But there might be other examples with Bolsonaro that you would like to think about. Would it be okay under the US system to impeach Bolsonaro for these reasons? And to what extent is it okay in the Brazilian system as well? In the Brazilian system, can you impeach someone because their policies are terrible? Okay. Sorry. Whoops. Hold on a second. Donald Trump. There we go. Okay. There are two examples of Donald Trump in impeachment. I should say, you know, the Donald Trump examples, I've been going through in a lot of detail about this test, but the Donald Trump facts, even though they're sensational, even though they're crazy and they're exciting, as a matter of law, there's not a lot of disagreement here about whether what Trump did was impeachable or not. It's actually fairly simple. So the first impeachment, right? Donald Trump is recorded on the phone, and he says, he's talking to the Ukrainian president. He says, I will give you a White House visit if you investigate some acts that Joe Biden committed when he was vice president. Right? Donald Trump is running against Joe Biden in the presidential election. He wants to make him look bad. And so he's asking the Ukrainian president to conduct an investigation over some activities that Biden was involved in Ukraine. And he says, if you do this, I'll give you a White House visit. If you don't do this, I'm going to withhold aid from Ukraine. And Ukraine at that time, and of course today, was even back then was fighting with Russia in a certain region. Great. So according to Black or Feldman, is this an impeachable offense? Okay. So Trump's lawyers make all kinds of wacky, dumb, and bad arguments that nobody takes seriously who cares about constitutional law, right? They say impeachment has to be a crime. We just talked about the fact nobody thinks impeachment has to be a crime. Who's a professor at a university? And they say, well, it wasn't for personal gain because trying to seek re-election isn't about personal gain. It's about making the country better. Right? So these arguments are not credible. So what I showed you were the arguments from the two constitutional law professors that were called before Congress, right? One, sorry, there was a typo, but one is from the Democrats, that's Noah Feldman, and one is by the Republicans, and that's Jonathan Turley. And Noah Feldman says, of course, this is impeachable. This isn't even a close question, right? Right? It's about abuse of power for personal gain. And here Donald Trump used the powers of the presidency, the promise of a White House visit, the withholding of military aid to try to gain re-election. Yes, that's going to be impeachable. But he's a Democrat. Ooh, you know, of course he's going to say it's impeachable, right? Maybe you're skeptical, right? Maybe everything is partisan, even Noah Feldman. But Turley, the Republican, says, yes, I agree. If there's what's called a quid pro quo, a trade of political favors, right, of presidential benefits, like a White House visit, then it's going to be impeachable. Turley's complaint is only about the amount of evidence, right, about the speed of the investigation, about the way it's being done. But the basic idea that this would be impeachable, he totally agrees with, right? The House is moving very quick. There are going to be midterm elections soon. They're afraid they're going to lose numbers. Turley is saying, slow down, spend more time. So no one disagrees that what Donald Trump did is impeachable. Okay, but what about the second Trump impeachment? In this case, what happened was the election happens, Donald Trump loses. Right? Nobody seriously really disputes this anymore. Donald Trump loses the election. But he goes around and he tells people, I didn't lose, this election is stolen. And he tells all these people to, in fact, he tells all these people, sorry, I have some issues with my screen all of a sudden. Everybody's good? Okay. He tells people on January 6th, this is the day Congress certifies who wins the election. We're going to have a big rally. It's about a 30-minute walk from the Capitol. He says, be there, be wild. He goes, gives a speech, and he tells all his followers, go on down, walk on down to the Capitol, get back your democracy. People go down, and it turns into an insurrection, right? A riot. And protesters actually pierce the Capitol. They get inside the Capitol. Members of Congress fear for their safety, right? They hide in their offices. The police are overwhelmed, and it takes a while to eventually get them out. It's frankly kind of a miracle. No member of Congress was killed. One of the insurrectionists is killed. A police officer shoots them. At the time, a lot of people think Donald Trump is going to actually be voted out, that this is a turning point. This is the moment Republicans are finally going to turn against Donald Trump. Ultimately, he's acquitted, right? The House impeaches Trump, but the Senate does not convict. I should say, anyway, in the House, it's 10 out of 203 Republicans, right? That's not nothing, but that's not a lot of Republicans turning against Donald Trump. This is not like Nixon. In the Senate, it's 7 out of 50 Republicans. Again, that's more impressive than 10 out of 211. That's saying something, but it's still far from what we experienced during the Nixon trial, right? What's really changed is our political system in the United States has become way more polarized. Right? It's not enough. He's acquitted. You need 67 votes in total. The vote is 57-43. So why is he acquitted? And someone asked this in a question. If things had been done differently, would he have been charged? And the answer is no. Right? I think no matter what, he's going to be acquitted. Republicans needed an excuse. Why? Because it's not because they're particularly bad people per se, but there are political incentives, right? If they vote to convict Trump, right, they're going to lose an election in the future. They know this, right? But on the other hand, they all seem to agree that what Trump did was really terrible at that time, at least. So they come up with excuses, right? So the article of impeachment is incitement of insurrection. The first excuse, he's already gone. Why are we going to vote someone out of office, convict someone when they're leaving in a couple months? That doesn't make any sense. They claim that not only is it illogical, but it's unconstitutional, that you can't do it. We can talk about this in more detail. The second problem, which I spent a little bit of time in the reading talking about, is the phrasing, right? Incitement of insurrection. Incitement is a legal term. Incitement of insurrection is a criminal charge, and it's supposed to be very demanding. It's very difficult to convict someone for incitement because of First Amendment concerns. And so to convict someone for incitement, it has to be advocacy of the use of force of law to produce imminent lawless or violent action. Imminent, right? It's supposed to be the next minute, right? And it's unclear whether what Donald Trump said meets this criteria. We fight like hell, and if you don't fight like hell, this is what Donald Trump says at the rally. We're not going to have a country anymore. So we're going to walk down to Pennsylvania Avenue. We're going to walk to the Capitol. I know everyone will be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. So is this advocacy of the use of force? Not clear. He's telling people to peacefully march, right? Is it imminent lawless action? It takes a couple of hours to get down there, right? So, but the whole point is, why, if you're the members of Congress, would you phrase the charge this way? Why wouldn't you say he was reckless? Why wouldn't you say he was irresponsible? Why wouldn't you, there's a lot of different ways you could have phrased the charge. And it just gave Republicans another excuse. Again, someone asked in the questions, would this have made a difference? I don't think so. But if you're the Democrats, you want to give as few outs as possible to hold Republicans responsible at this moment. I think that is my 35 minutes. But just to sum up, the basic idea of impeachment in the US system, and I think I've hit this point, I've nailed this point into the ground, right, is that it can't be for just anything, right? It can't be because you don't like the president's policies. It has to be because they use the office for personal gain, right? Richard Nixon is the paradigm example of doing this. Andrew Johnson is another interesting case, right? Because he seemed to use the office not for personal gain, but because he really was a racist and he thought racism was right. And under the US system, the argument is that he should be acquitted. And then lastly, Donald Trump, the examples are not that interesting from this perspective. It's obvious that he should be impeached. And it's only kind of prudential or other concerns that makes Republicans argue that he shouldn't be impeached in these cases. And lastly, I'm just curious about the Brazilian system, the difference between maladministration and probity in administration and Bolsonaro, whether there's an idea that he'll be impeached for his actual policies rather than abuse of office. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Joshua. I think is a very, very didactic, very clear exposition. There are many points. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Many points. Thank you very much. It was a brilliant presentation and very clear. And I think we Brazilians discover many points in common with the United States. But I'm going to pass to Professor Mafei, that I'm sure he has better comments than mine. So, Professor Mafei, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Maria Paula. Thank you very much, Joshua, for your presentation. A lot of interesting facts brought to all of us. Maria Paula, how much time do I have? 15 minutes?
20, 15 I have,
okay.
But if you a bit more,
okay.
No problem.
So yeah,
okay.
I'll try to be. I have many things written down here, so I'll try to be brief so we can leave more space for the discussion afterwards. I think it's worth starting off with the discussion of the grounds of impeachment, and I think that would help clear your question, Joshua, regarding maladministration and probity in administration. Although Brazil copied the presidential impeachment model roughly from the United States in 1891, when we became a republic, Brazil is a rare example of a Latin American country that remained a monarchy throughout the 19th century after becoming independent. And during our monarchical period in the 19th century, we had a law, that statute that criminalized with actual imprisonment the conduct of high public officials. So it was a criminal offense tried by Senate, nevertheless, but still a criminal offense. This required that the constitutional provision, which was quite broad, was detailed in a criminal statute that outlined more specific crimes that detail these broad constitutional provisions. When we became a republic, we sort of retained the same model, which, if I'm not mistaken, is what also happens in Argentina. So we do have constitutional provisions that are quite broad, those in Article 85, which you read out, but we have a federal statute that details these provisions into specific crimes within each one of those categories. This is true for the crimes against the property of the country. Those are in Article 9 of Federal Law 1079. It's a law from 1950, but that remains valid in the 1988 Constitution. And this statute under Article 9 has 7 detailed crimes that tell us what is actually the possible grounds of impeachment regarding improbity and administration. Okay, so although we do have these broad categories in the Constitution, the impeachment statute details both the procedure and the specific grounds of impeachment. I think it is, it's tough to say that anything is consensual in Brazil, but I think most people who study impeachment in Brazil do acknowledge that what Mason called maladministration should not be grounds for impeachment. A president has a right to propose policies and try to enforce policies. These policies may be successful, they may be unsuccessful. They may be unsuccessful because there were bad policies from the start. They may be good ideas that he or she executed poorly, but nevertheless, that is not grounds for impeachment. In my opinion, the substantive grounds for impeachment are much more similar to what Black proposes in the US system. So you need something that is very serious. You need something that involves some sort of political villainy. And I would add, you need something that cannot be corrected through ordinary, less traumatic legal measures. So presidents, governors, and mayors sort of eventually break the law now and then. But a lot of what judges do is issuing, warrants and decisions that keep these illegal acts from going in effect. So basically, every time the Brazilian Supreme Court says this presidential decree is unconstitutional, the court is basically saying the president violated the Constitution. But you wouldn't impeach a president for an unconstitutional decree because we have devised a less traumatic and more expedient system of doing that. And because those other criteria would not be met. I think what Bolsonaro's case regarding COVID depends a lot of how you frame what he did. And in my interpretation, I think the proper manner to frame what Bolsonaro did, and I think this is disputable, people can say I'm wrong, but I think what Bolsonaro did was, Bolsonaro had, when the COVID pandemic broke out, he devised, after a short while, a political strategy. And the strategy was, since vaccination became a request and a policy that was primarily taken and successfully delivered by a person whom we imagine would be his main political rival this year, because President Lula was in prison, and I mean he was not viable as a candidate. So the former governor of São Paulo, was to many people a possible political adversary. And I think Bolsonaro very clearly knew that this guy was his political adversary, would be in these year's election. The governor of São Paulo was the one who took the opportunity of having a very prestigious institution in the state of São Paulo called Butantan, that is an institution that makes vaccines for the whole country for over 100 years now. And he said, we are going to produce vaccines for the whole country. And I am going to be the person, I am going to become a politician of national prestige by providing quick and effective vaccines for the entire country. Bolsonaro, on the other hand, chose a different policy strategy. His policy strategy was, I'm not going to wait for vaccines. Vaccines are going to be too long. I don't want everybody locked up in their homes. This is going to be bad for the economy. So what I'm going to do is, I am not going to get in line for vaccines. I don't want to look like the person who wanted to get vaccines first but lost. He actually ignored a bunch of offers from major vaccine manufacturers. This was afterwards proven in a Senate investigation. And not only that, he said, I'm going to use my platform and my prestige to disseminate every kind of lie and disbelief I can about vaccines to prevent people from getting vaccinated, or at least to create a reasonable doubt as to whether vaccines work and to discredit the policy of this possible adversary that I might have in 2022. So it wasn't the case that he actually tried to implement a policy that didn't work out. And my interpretation when he did was, he flagrantly used both his platform and his government to not buy vaccines and to create popular fears regarding vaccines in order not to give his political adversary the triumph of being the person who was more expedient and more competent in providing vaccines for the whole country. So it's different, for example, from the case in, I think it was Sweden, where the government actually, it was not just bad policy. It was a political strategy that put on the balance. He said, well, yeah, I might have 100, 200,000 more deaths, but that's the price of not giving this award, this political triumph for my adversary. So I think that is one interpretation of what he did. And it's personally my interpretation of what he did. So I think it goes beyond just incompetence. I think it's a very Shakespearean political villainy kind of situation. So yeah, but I think this is debatable, even as to my interpretation of the facts. What I would like to add something more on the aspect, and I think this showed up in your presentation a lot, regarding the trial factor. And I don't think you mentioned this in your presentation, but if I'm not mistaken, when sitting for an impeachment trial, the senators have to take a special oath that they would sort of act as judges, if I'm not mistaken. We don't have anything like that in Brazil, but the Constitution does say that the president has to be put through a trial, a julgamento, which is not the same as an ordinary political vote. So a trial sort of revolves around the idea that there will be a delimited accusation, there will be facts, we will debate evidence, and that the judges sitting for a trial should present their verdict on what happened based on minimally what the proven facts are and what a decent interpretation of the law requires. And this is a major debate, I think, in Brazil, because people are very skeptical about the possibility that anything that actually looks like a trial may take place in the Senate, because the Senate is full of politicians. Our political system is structured around parties. Parties have huge stakes in presidential impeachments. The political system in Brazil is highly fragmented, unlike the United States. So a lot of the support for or against impeachment revolves around the fact that the president or the vice president, because that's a not important difference in Brazil, during the trial, the president steps down from office. The vice president becomes the president during the trial, which basically means that the president loses any kind of political power that he has to defend himself. You mentioned the Andrew Johnson impeachment. I like very much a book by Michael S. Benedict on the Andrew Johnson impeachment. And Benedict is very accurate in describing how Johnson was politically very active during his impeachment trial as to sort of try to bring the moderate wing of the rival party to compromise with him and with his lawyers. So he sort of used the powers of the presidency in a sense that a Brazilian president absolutely cannot do. Once the House of Representatives allows votes for the impeachment to be allowed, the trial to take place in Senate, and the Senate starts the trial, the president has to step down, and he becomes sort of a political zombie, because the vice president, and that's another key factor in Brazil, is usually not from the same party as the president. So the vice president can sort of become an independent political force. And when he sees the possibility of becoming president, this actually happened very clearly in the Dilma Rousseff impeachment. And it also happened quite clearly in the 1992 impeachment of Fernando Collor. The vice president sort of steps out of the shadow and says, hey, I'm here. Let's talk. Let's have some meetings. Let's discuss what you might want from my future government. And I am sure we will all be better off. And this is, I think, another point in which Bolsonaro was highly skilled in picking vice presidents that Congress absolutely distrusts. His current vice president is an army general that has absolutely no political life, relevant political life in Brasilia, unlike Dilma Rousseff's vice president, and unlike Fernando Collor's vice president, who were both very experienced politicians who had a political life that was prior and highly independent of the president, President Collor and President Dilma. So if I'm sure you're going to have the word again, I would like to hear more from you, how you see these political partisan determinants and how they can square off with the legal requirement that what happens in the Senate is actually a trial, or how much is it merely not a political calculation game. Maybe in the Nixon case, what happened was some of these more traditional Republicans said, you have become too much of a burden for me and for the party, regardless of the legal merits of your accusation. So what role do you think an actual interpretation of the law can have? And this is something that really puzzles me. And in Brazil, the manner in which the voting takes place in the Senate is even less appropriate for a trial, because in the US, as I understand, you have articles and you have to vote on the articles. In Brazil, you have sort of this, Roman emperor kind of thing where you throw in a bunch of accusations and everybody says yes or no. So, I mean, if you have 6 different accusations, what if I think that you're guilty of 2 and innocent of 4? How should I vote in Brazil? You see, it's sort of, it all hangs from
that's interesting.
Party calculations.
Yeah, so I like when you said when the vice president stepped out of the shadows, you actually stepped out of the shadows in your office. You probably couldn't see that, but anyway, yeah, those are fantastic questions, and it remind me of other questions I wanted to ask. So maybe first, sorry, can I respond, Maria? Am I cutting people off?
Yes. I will propose if we can go until 4 o'clock, until 2 p.m.,
Sure.
I think we accommodate even the student's question.
Sure. I have no life. I'm here.
So go ahead.
Yeah. So first, how serious, how principled is the trial in the United States? I mean, it's political all the way down, of course. Very, very close. Especially now. The interesting question for me is about the political party structure, right? It's one thing to say it's political all the way down, but you have to think that doesn't just mean that Republicans are going to vote no, right, when it's their person, or Democrats are going to vote yes, right? The political incentives are much more complicated than that. And so what you said about the Nixon case is exactly correct. In the judgment of Republicans at that time, there are two relevant things. The Republicans said, look, if we vote Richard Nixon out because he's doing horrible in Vietnam, right? If we vote Richard Nixon out because he's really unpopular over the economy, there's a lot of inflation at that time. Whose fault is Vietnam? Whose fault is the economy? It's the Republican Party. It's their policies that are doing it, right? One of the famous senators who ends up kicking Nixon out as a Republican says, the question is, would you buy a used car from Richard Nixon? Right? Because they want to distract, they want to offload the question from Republican Party policies onto it being about Richard Nixon himself. So if they vote Nixon out, right, it doesn't reflect on them. Okay. But that only matters back then because our political system was so much less polarized, right? There were liberals in the Republican Party. There were conservatives in the Democratic Party. This is complicated, and I can't do it justice here. And there were a lot more centrists, right? People who probably often voted Republican, but could be disgusted enough by what Richard Nixon did that they would vote Democrat. It has to do with our primary system here, how nominees are chosen. So that's the American system. I of course can talk about it more. The Brazilian system, as you mentioned, and as I barely understand, not only is this question about the vice president stepping out of the shadows to mayor versus, I guess, the more military figure in the case of Bolsonaro, but you have a million parties that are super fragmented. And you have to form coalitions. And I don't understand in a meaningful way the political dynamics that it creates. Is it mostly a patronage system, basically, where they'll dump the president at the first opportunity, or not? The only other thing I'll say about the trial, and then I want to say one other thing about the Bolsonaro. It's interesting because I didn't talk about this, but there's a role in the Brazilian system for the Supreme Court. There is no role in the U.S. system for the Supreme Court at all. One of the readings I sent is basically someone appealing to the Supreme Court saying this isn't a trial, right? The procedures aren't being followed. This has to do with the judge, and the Supreme Court says this is none of our business. We're not going to get involved. And so, when I think about the Brazilian system, and because there's some role for the Supreme Court, I thought it was more illegal in some ways. And so your point about them not voting on individual articles is really interesting. The Bolsonaro stuff, I really don't want to step into a minefield here. And I don't know what the politics are of students of the class. But to me, that argument, why it's interesting, why it's plausible, has some real problems. And it's something that we've confronted to some extent in the United States, because policies of presidents, of course, are always implicated in political calculations, right? When the Democratic Party does something to help unions, it's because the Democratic Party wants unions to support and vote for them in the next election. When the Democratic Party does something, frankly, to help African Americans, right? When Joe Biden says, I'm going to appoint, I promise you, when he's running for office, I will appoint a Black woman as the first person to be on the Supreme Court. He did that. Maybe it's because he thought it was good policy, but he did it because that was the only way he could get the endorsement of a very important Black representative when he was running in South Carolina. And so it seems like it can be very difficult to get to figure out what policies the president are doing because they're good policies and which ones help them win re-election. Now, maybe the Bolsonaro one is so egregious, right? So disgusting, and costs so many lives that it's different. And I'm not saying it's not a plausible argument, but it's a really hard one. And it's one, at least, that in the United States, no one has ever been impeached for. Those kinds of arguments have always failed. They haven't been very prominent, but they have failed. So those are just my reactions. And I'd love to hear more about the Brazilian system and the political incentives, which are so much harder for me to understand, both because it's foreign, right? But also and different, but also because so many more parties. The dynamics of that, I'd be really curious to understand better.
Thank you, Joshua.
Maria Paula, can I just say one quick thing?
Okay. Go ahead.
Regarding the functioning of the Brazilian political system. Political scientists in 1988, 1989, when they read the Constitution, they said, oh boy, this is gonna fail big time. This cannot work. And it turns out that after Collor, for the two presidencies of Fernando Henrique Cardoso and the two presidencies of Lula, the system worked, and the president has a lot of tools that he can use to co-opt political parties and political leaderships around his government, and it sort of worked out well. When we tried to understand what went wrong with the Dilma administration, I think that we cannot ignore a single political event that happened in Brazil during the 2014, 2016 period, which was this sort of the Italian clean hands operation in Brazil, which is called the car wash operation. And it was a major factor in breaking any kind of possible trust among political leaders and political parties. And I think there's a quite reasonable consensus that Dilma's fate was sealed because of at least from the perspective of the political actors in Congress, of the perspective that the change in government would help halt car wash operation. And I think they just missed the president because they thought Dilma's vice president would be able to do that. He wasn't. The person who was able to do that was actually Bolsonaro. So yeah, so this is an important thing, I think, to throw in but this is this could go on for a long time. I think we should get to the questions of the students. There are actually some very good questions that I'd like to hear the answer to.
I would like to make a short comment and to give the floor to the students, and after that we can make another round, if you don't mind. I have prepared a comment, but it's similar in some points with the ones Rafael made. And I'm going to read because I prepared like this. I myself have experienced the impeachment of the two presidents. Collor's impeachment in 1992 was considered a big task for a newly democratized Brazil. At that time, the two rounds election system was not in place, and Collor, an outsider, as Bolsonaro now, has been elected by a narrow margin of ballots. He was charged with corruption, and a parliamentary committee of inquiry has shed light on undisputed evidence about his misdemeanors and pork barrel. There were massive marches against Collor all over the country. When he resigned, the Senate didn't accept the resignation. And something curious for Joshua is that the Supreme Court decided the case 22 years later. The Supreme Court judged the case and absolved Collor based on the lack of evidence, but it was too late. At that time, Collor had already recovered his political rights and returned to political life as a senator. At the time of the impeachment, and now my position is coincident with Rafael's, the vice president, at the time of Collor's impeachment, the vice president was Itamar Franco, a well-reputed politician from a democratic tradition who acted to overthrow the authoritarian regime. His government settled the grounds for the longest democratic era in Brazil. After his term, there was a smooth political transition to Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who, as his economy secretary, has defeated hyperinflation in Brazil. And after Cardoso to Lula, there was also a smooth transition, political transition. So that we had almost 16 years of democracy between the two impeachments. If we can say that Itamar term was the actual beginning of the post-1988 constitutional democratic era in Brazil, President Dilma's impeachment in 2016 is the end of this era. Her impeachment has been entirely different from the former. The charge against her was abstract and very difficult to understand. We can say it was similar to the US case for maladministration mentioned by Professor Joshua. Maybe Rafael can comment on this. The Workers' Party, PT, ruled the country for 13 years. The opposition party, the Party of Brazilian Social Democracy, PSDB, which was Cardoso's party, has lost its fourth election. After Cardoso, they lost four elections. The vice president then was Michel Temer, a conservative former congressman with great ability among his peers. He launched a plan called A Bridge to the Future, in which some of the current ideas of democratic backsliding had already appeared. So previously from Bolsonaro, there were Temer. Temer has signed this switch, this conservative switch. After Dilma's impeachment, which occurred simultaneously with Lugo's impeachment in Paraguay in 2000, Lugo is a bit previous, in 2012, some scholars minimized its political impact by comparing their removal to a British parliamentary vote of no confidence. Something that is mentioned I think in Black's text you send us. By the way, thank you, precious material for us to understand the matter in the US. Under President Bolsonaro's government, the problem was the opposite. More than 100 requests remain ignored by the speakers of the House. First, Representative Rodrigo Maia, and now Arthur Lira, despite the popular protest. Nowadays, a committee is working on a draft for the revision of Law 1079 of 1950. The first objective is a revision of the list of crimes and misdemeanors to be better defined and not subject to discretionary decisions by the prosecutors, as seemed to have occurred in Dilma's case. For the case of probity mentioned in your presentation, these days we have a large number of decisions under the improbity law of 1992, a law that has been approved just after Collor's impeachment. This law provides the parameters of what probity is. But not surprisingly, the improbity law has been revised last year to get a stricter definition of unlawful improbity, especially due to Article 11's open clause that refers to violation of the duties of honesty. And on these grounds, many politicians have been condemned. The second objective of this revision copes with procedural matter, establishing clear rules to avoid ad hoc regulation. So I think we have, it's surprising to see that we have many things in common. And unfortunately, Brazil has some lessons to give about the matter, but that's it. I don't know if you want to comment something, Joshua, or if I better pass to the students' question.
I would love to comment and have many questions, but I also know students have been waiting. So I'll just say one student also asked about I didn't completely understand it, but you've explained it very clearly to me before, this issue of which charges get taken up and how much discretion does the leader of the House or the Senate have to do it. And there have been somewhat similar controversies in the United States. It's up to the House leader, I think whether to introduce a charge, and the House leader is whoever's the majority party in the United States. So, 52% Republicans, it'll be up to the Republican Party whether to introduce it. Once the Republican Party votes in the House, let's say to impeach a Democratic president, the Senate has to hold a trial. That's what most people believe. Anyway, but I'll let the students ask. But that was so great, especially the revisions and the probity stuff. That was great, and the contrast between Collar and the current one.
Okay, so now we have the questions of the students. I would ask, I have received questions from 4 of them: Danilo, Ulisses, Juliana, and Maria Paula. Does anyone want to make the question orally, or do you prefer that I have passed the first? Juliana, Ulisses, and Danilo, I have already sent them to Professor Joshua. What do you prefer?
You asking me or the class?
No, the class, the students. Danilo, especially Danilo, Ulisses, Juliana, and Maria Paula. And we have also some people in the YouTube, about 11 people following us on YouTube. Well, would you like Joshua to pick one of that questions?
Sure, I would love. Why don't we try and start out with one live question, and then I'll start going down the ones. Does anybody want to ask?
Students are shy. Danilo, don't be shy.
Okay, nice to meet you, Professor. It's a pleasure. I did 2 questions. First, in Brazil, the president of the Chamber, House of Representatives, has an important role in the impeachment process, as it is up to him to carry out a preliminary analysis of the request and proceeding, with no deadline from him to manifest himself in this regard. No? Does the same thing happen in the United States?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think the answer is yes, but it doesn't matter. And the reason it doesn't matter is because our party system is different, right? So, I mean, I don't understand how it would work in the Brazilian system, but in the U.S., if it's a majority, let's say right now President Biden is a Democrat, and there was a majority of Democrats in the House, well, of course they're not going to impeach, right? So the fact that the Democrat won't allow impeachment charges to happen when Republicans are pushing for it doesn't seem to really matter. There's been no time in United States history where there's been I might be wrong, so I'm on YouTube, so I should be careful, but if I'm correct, I should look this up. There's never been a time where the House has been of the same party as the president and voted for impeachment, right? So, it was Democrats in the House of Representatives who voted to impeach Richard Nixon. It was Democrats in the House of Representatives who voted to impeach Donald Trump. And so you could imagine maybe if there was a disagreement within the Democratic Party about whether to impeach a president, maybe that would be a problem. And I think in the first Trump impeachment, Pelosi waited for moderate Democrats to get on board. There's this moment where moderate Democrats publish an op-ed saying Donald Trump should be impeached. And that's a real turning point. And so it is up to the discretion of the House Majority Leader, but it's not been much of a political issue. My guess is, and you should tell me, in Brazil, it's a political issue because the coalitional structure of the parties, because there are so many, I think creates much more complicated political calculations, right? About the leader of the House, right? The leader of the House doesn't necessarily represent the majority's opinion very easily because there's so many shifting parties with different priorities who are in coalition. But I don't know. You have to tell me about Brazil.
Joshua, can I ask a follow-up question?
Yes,
Sure.
yes. May I suggest that you, Rafael, explain a bit how it functions with Arthur Lira and
the federal impeachment statute that regulates the procedure says, textually says, because in Brazil, any citizen can offer an accusation of an impeachable offense. So I actually have written one of the 200, I don't know how many already, the one Bolsonaro has had against him. So any person can go there and just, file an accusation for a high crime against the president. This gets sent to the leader of the House. And the law says the leader of the House will get this accusation, send it to a committee, an impeachment committee, and there the merits of this accusation will be discussed. Over time, political practice in the House of Representatives gave the president of the House of Representatives a power to sort of read and read the accusation and see if it meets the basic requirements. For example, you have to prove that you are in full possession of your political rights. Okay, so if you fail to submit evidence of this, your signature has to be notarized. So if the president of the House of Representatives says, "Oops, signature not notarized," this goes straight to the bin. Okay, what not only Arthur Lira, but the president, which is our current president of the House of Representatives, but the guy before him did was when he gets the accusation, he doesn't send it to the committee, nor does he send it to the archive. He retains it and gives no decision, because by giving no decision, you cannot appeal his decision either way. And that is not a power that the law or the Constitution give the Speaker of the House, the President of the House. So there has been much dispute as to whether the President of the House of Representatives can withhold accusations against the President, especially because in the case of Arthur Lira, it is very clear that he uses this as a tool of political bargain, in the worst sense of the word bargain. What we have today is Bolsonaro, as a matter of fact, was not impeached because he sort of renounced the administration of the federal budget. The president of the House of Representatives runs the federal budget today, and this makes him the most beloved politician for his peers in the history of Congress, because this guy can distribute huge amounts of money that congressmen and congresswomen can use very parochially as a huge advantage for the upcoming election. So this is the explanation. And my question is, can Nancy Pelosi withhold an accusation? And how does, I understand she has to somehow negotiate and sort of wait for the best moment for that.
Yeah, she can withhold. I haven't really thought about it, but I'm pretty sure she can withhold an accusation. So, it's complicated actually. So, I haven't really, but generally at least, when debate is determined, I have to think about this. It's more the question for someone who studies Congress than a constitutional scholar in some ways, but it, what the House gets to discuss is determined usually by the Speaker of the House. right? So, and this can create real problems, right? Because, you know, in immigration, for example, right? When Republicans were a majority in Congress, you know, let's say 4/5 of Republicans were against immigration, but a fifth against immigration reform, but a fifth were for it, right? And so if you just had a majority vote, 1/5 Republicans who are the majority, plus all of the Democrats, they would have voted to reform immigration, right? But the Speaker of the House was a Republican, and he said, I'm not going to introduce legislation that's going to divide my party, that's going to create a fight within my party. And just the same, right? If there's a majority who wants to impeach the president, right? But it's, you know, it's Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, let's say, Nancy Pelosi will likely not introduce that legislation. There might be ways to circumvent Nancy Pelosi. It might not be as final as you're saying. You know, for one thing, they could vote her out as the House Majority Leader, but it's very unlikely and very rare that those procedures would be used. Now, we don't have it so that an average citizen gets to introduce impeachment resolutions. So we don't have this problem of like, there's this buildup of resolutions that should just meet some very basic requirements. But if another member of the House, a Republican, Democrat, they want to introduce it, Nancy Pelosi doesn't want it, I think it's effectively dead, usually.
Thank you, professors. We have one question from YouTube, but I asked before if Juliana, that is here, if she wants to or maybe Juliana, I can present this Thiago Cereja de Mello question because it's I think you have already answered. Just there's a little nuance. He asks, Bolsonaro's impeachment requests are very unlikely to go forward due to the unwillingness of the president of the House of Representatives to put them to vote. And then he completes, is there a legal remedy in comparative constitutional design to prevent this locking from happening? It seems like a huge problem of coalition president systems.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that's a very similar question, and my answer is similar. I guess the interesting question for me, you know, it's horrible what Arturo Lira is doing. It's obviously against the law. But the interesting question to me as a comparativist is, you know, what happens when it does meet the requirements, it does go to committee. What happens then? You know, who sits on the committee in Brazil, you know, what determines whether, because if anybody, if, you know, Rafael, you know, he throws in a charge, Maria Paula throws in a charge, Juliana throws in a charge, right? Like, is it just going to be the committee who decides, and who gets to be on the committee is an interesting question for me. But I know there's another question waiting.
Okay, thank you. Juliana, do you want to formulate your question?
Hello, good afternoon. I think João is waiting
yes.
for...
No, you are first, then
okay.
I call up João, okay?
Okay, so good afternoon and nice to meet you, Professor Joshua. I think you already answered my questions that I have thought, but there's a second question that I thought about, and is there any difference considering political influences between the impeachment procedure involving the president and judges? I don't know if this is the point of this conversation, but when I was studying for this class, I made a research and I looked that none of the presidents of the United States were convicted, and we cannot say the same about some judges. So that's why I thought if there is any difference, or it was only circumstantial things that happened. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think the simplest answer is there's no real difference. At least formally, there's no real difference. There's no difference in the Constitution about it. There's nothing you could point to and say, aha, there's a difference. I will say that impeachment of judges can be a lot. It's not clear that you need as much of a trial. You're not going to call witnesses. You know, in the example of that case that I assigned, the Judge Walter Nixon, they basically, you know, it goes to a committee, they write a report, and they take a vote. You would never do that for a president, right? There's kind of an expectation for a president you would do more. The only other thing I'll say about judges that's really important is, you know, probably the first most important impeachments were about judges, and they fail. Well, one succeeds and the other fails. One fails because the guy's a drunk and a nutcase. The other one, though, fails, and the idea is that you can't impeach judges because you hate their decisions, even if they're really bad decisions. You know, it's kind of similar to you can't get rid of the president because you hate it. I mean, you know, it's interesting to me to even think through why it is for judges. I get it. You know, they're there to be independent or something. But for presidents, it's not really clear to me, especially in the US system. You know, it's so hard to get to 2/3. You know, the president's policies would have to be really insane. And, you know, maybe of the kind that the way that Bolsonaro's COVID policies were characterized for you to impeach him. And it's not clear to me why you shouldn't be able to get rid of a president for quote unquote maladministration. I don't, you know, what we say normally in the United States is, well, it's the will of the people or something like that. But, you know, you're going to get a vice president who's going to be of the same party. Our vice president sometimes can be pretty different than the president. That happens once in a long while. I talked about Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson, but that's pretty rare. You know, a lot of people early on in talking about impeachment of Donald Trump said, why are we going to impeach Donald Trump? The vice president is going to be, I just lost his name. This is embarrassing. But anyway, he was seen as being, he wasn't as insane as Donald Trump, but the fear of people, of Democrats, was he would be more popular than Donald Trump and have basically the same policies, Mike Pence. Of course, it's different in Brazil. It was brought up. If you impeach, when you impeached Rousseff, Temer was not like a more effective version of Rousseff, or like, you know, someone who had very different political priorities. So anyway, I know there's another question, but great question. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Now we have João Paulo.
Thank you, Professor. Good afternoon, all. Thank you, Professor Braver, for your class. Thank you, Professor Mafei. Well, we are discussing here in Brazil, Professor Braver, the similarities between Trump's US and Bolsonaro's Brazil, and how they dismantle public policies, especially that ones that support poor people, and how they eroded the institutions, the Constitution, and how they didn't respect that unwritten rules and behaviors that are expected from presidents in a democracy. And well, and we could see a deeply polarization between left and right here in Brazil, and I suppose is the same between Democrats and Republicans in US. And I was thinking about the midterm elections this year, and all the polls are saying that probably Republicans will get the control of the two houses. And how could it be in this actually in this situation that we are living now, if it is you understand that it's possible that Republicans try to manage an impeachment against Biden without any kind of legal foundation, legal fundamentation, I don't know, using this as a once more as a a way that eroding Constitution, bringing another perspective to Trump because he still is a political that wants to be a president again, right? So if it's possible to imagine an impeachment against Biden.
Yeah, that's a great question. I hadn't really thought about it. I mean, yeah, so the question I think is, if Republicans, as they likely are, if they win back the House of Representatives, will they impeach Joe Biden? I hadn't thought about it. So I can say in the Senate, right, they're not going to convict because you need 67 votes. But I think you're right, and I think it's a profound insight that you have, that the real fear has been that impeachment used to be so rare. When the Richard Nixon impeachment happened, the last one was like during the Civil War. There really wasn't very much written about it. People hadn't really thought about it. Now in my lifetime, anyone who was alive during the Richard Nixon impeachment had never seen another impeachment before in their lifetime, right? But now, yeah, it's becoming a lot more common. I've lived through 3 impeachments, and I'm not that old. And the fear has been that we are going to reach a point where whenever the House is of a different party than the president, they'll vote to impeach them. And if I had to bet, I think you're right. I mean, I don't think they'll do it the first day they get into office. Although it's not uncommon in many countries for impeachment resolutions to come very, very fast. But they'll wait and they'll find something, and it may not be, reasonable, but it will be on Fox News. And yeah, I think they'll vote to impeach Joe Biden. And then all the questions that people have had about whether you'll have a trial or not will really have a lot of bite. And, if you had asked me before your question, does the Senate have to have a trial every time the House impeaches? I would have said, yes, of course. People were outraged at the suggestion because it was majority Republicans during the first Donald Trump impeachment that they wouldn't hold a trial. But if the House is going to impeach, every time it's of a different party, then, why are we going to have a full trial every single time? That seems like a real problem. And, this is what happens is in our system and in your system, I suppose, too, when one piece of the puzzle changes in some way, then all the other pieces, have to change in some other way, too. And people will cry bloody murder if they don't have a trial of Joe Biden, because it will be a break with precedent. But the people will say, well, that's only because you broke precedent, because you voted for a trivial charge. And this is how our system becomes very messy during these moments of change. So great question. I mean, the other thing, too, that people are really worried about in the United States, we didn't have it this time. So maybe this is evidence that your worry is too much. But, for us to appoint members of the cabinet, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of War, you need the Senate to approve it. And it's been a Republican Senate. And so there was a real worry when Joe Biden was elected. Would Republican senators refuse to confirm any members of the cabinet? Would we have a government structure that didn't work? And ultimately, Republicans did vote to confirm from them. So, maybe that vote's on the other side. Sorry, I'll wrap up. But the difference is the Senate tends to be much less partisan, much less ideological than the House. Why? Because they go up for election every 6 years rather than every 2 years. Only a third of the Senate goes up for election it's staggered terms. So senators are elected by the entire state. So they tend to be much more moderate, whereas members of the House are elected by some gerrymandered small portion that are much more ideological, homogeneous. So yeah, if I was a betting man, I hadn't thought about it. It's a great question. I think they probably will vote to impeach Joe Biden if they get the House, and it will be a break with all precedent and a real change in a lot of different pieces of impeachment going forward.
So thank you. And I think we can go again to Rafael Mafei to wrap up our considerations.
Well, I think I've already spoken a lot. I just want to thank Maria Paula for making this happen. I want to thank Joshua for the wonderful, your wonderful talk, and it was a pleasure to speak with you. I hope we can keep on discussing impeachment, and I think in the near future, both in the United States and in Brazil, impeachment will somehow be always, on the menu, because both countries have become so politically polarized. It's unfortunately something that's going to be maybe a card that's going to be played more than it should. I hope we can keep in touch, and I want to thank all the students for their participation and their wonderful contributions. Thank you very much, Joshua and Maria Paula.
Thank you so much to Rafael, to Maria Paula for organizing, and for the students, the wonderful questions that were sent in and were asked. This was an absolute pleasure. My hope in doing this was somewhat selfish. I thought I would learn more than maybe I would give to you all, and I learned so much from your questions and from the comments. So it really was a pleasure for me. Thank you.
Well, so it comes to me. I think let me just ask you if any other student has questions
Sure.
to do. Any other question, or we can wrap up the session. Well, I think it was wonderful. It's not true that you received more than you gave. We learned a lot about the United States, and there are two interesting things. First is that Professor Braver, in fact, I think you are studying more deeply the problem of court packing than especially impeachment. When we've talked in Madison, I thought the impeachment issue is more closer to what it's happening in Brazil. But I think it's very interesting to think about court packing. And I think Brazil, despite what the result of elections, of October elections will be, we will need to think a lot about the rules for the composition of judiciary, our courts, etc. And I think we have many things to learn from your experience.
Maria Paula, can I add something? Yes, I didn't know Joshua was so keen on the topic of court packing. Yeah. Yesterday, there was a constitutional amendment presented.
Yes,
actually, it wasn't presented yesterday. Oh, you were going to say that. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No. Go ahead. Because this is.
No, please. Sorry, I didn't know.
No. Go ahead, and I add something after. Go ahead.
It's the Congress is seriously picking up a discussion on whether Congress can overturn a Supreme Court decision if the decision is non-unanimous.
Yes.
Basically saying, well, regardless of what you think the Constitution says, this is what Congress wants the Constitution to mean. So we can vote down a Supreme Court decision. So things are pretty wild.
Yeah, I mean, we have lots and lots of experience in similar situations like that. Dozens, almost maybe a dozen examples or something like that. So yeah, that would be another very interesting discussion to talk about. I'd be very curious to hear more, and good luck with that.
And to close this thing, adding to what Rafael said, because I was going to comment on this, to add to what he said about the budget. There's a part of budget, it's been called the secret budget. So the president of the House has the power of managing the budget, but besides, it has a secret part of the budget, non-transparent. And so he uses this to co-opt allies for no matter what is the issue. And we are living, although we talk always about Bolsonaro, but I think we have something deeper, is that Congress, this functioning of the Congress is anti-democratic, or it's supporting a backsliding at this time. So let's pray that we have a better situation after October, and that we run the elections normally, and that we can breathe after that.
Yeah, our countries unfortunately are facing a lot of the same challenges. Yeah, it's scary.
Okay. Well, but the thing that it's not scary is that we have had a wonderful dialogue. We've learned a lot, and I think the students liked. Even people which were outside the Zoom class formulated questions. So I'm grateful for you to having accepted my invitation. I'm grateful for Rafael Mafei by his ideas and by his comments. And many thanks for the students that prepared themselves for the section. I think we have had a wonderful session, a wonderful dialogue. And thank you very much, Professor Joshua Braver, for coming and to making this possible. So I hope to see you in Madison, and maybe you come back in other sessions to comment other things in this dialogue.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
See ya.
Thank you, Joshua. Thank you, Maria Paula. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Goodbye.